'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring except me, coming at you with episode 35 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I want to thank you all for joining me and spending some of your Christmas Eve or perhaps Christmas Day with me. If you're checking out the YouTube version of the podcast and you haven't done so already, don't forget to click like, smash that subscriber bell. Or if you're checking out the audio version of the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or the other platforms and you enjoy the content, and only if you enjoy the content, please click like and subscribe. So I want to talk about a movie which is among many, I have so many favorites, but which is among my favorites, and I can't make the argument that it's a Christmas movie because it's not a Christmas movie. But it's a movie that has a memorable scene set around Christmas, which goes into themes which really are not Christmassy type of themes, and it works in the world of the movie. And that film is Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, a Vietnam War movie that's not really a Vietnam War movie because there's very little conventional combat that we see on screen, and a lot about dehumanization and taking men and making them something other than men, in the instance of this movie, of making them, similar to A Clockwork Orange, perfect machines. In the case of Full Metal Jacket and the mindset of the United States military, or at least in the view of Stanley Kubrick, turning them into perfect killing machines. And my first exposure to Full Metal Jacket, not surprisingly, was on good old HBO. And it was one of those movies, because I talked on previous podcasts about films that I was supposed to like, such as Blade Runner, such as Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, that when I first saw, they just didn't resonate with me. In the case of Full Metal Jacket, the first time I saw it, it was immediately one of my certainly 10 favorite movies of all time. And bear in mind, when you're 14 or 15 or 16 years old, you don't have the scope of knowledge that you're going to get later in life. So me saying something is in my top 10 now carries a lot more weight than 1989 Jeremy saying, "Oh my God, I love that movie." Because there are films that once upon a time were one of my favorites, like Action Jackson. Now listen, Action Jackson, it's fun action. Carl Weathers is great. It's a riot. Craig T. Nelson before Coach. Vanity, the late, what was her name? Denise Matthews. It's a lot of fun, but for me to have ever put that movie in my top 10, 2 thumbs down for me for that one. But Full Metal Jacket is a film which has endured for me, and in the career of Stanley Kubrick, it's a slightly polarizing, and I mean that it's not as polarizing as Eyes Wide Shut, where I have read reams of material. That's, of course, Kubrick's last film, starring Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman in a very fucked up marriage story. That film I've read a lot, where major critics, it's one of Kubrick's top 5 easy, and other critics, it's clearly the worst film that Stanley ever made, and a kind of a little bit of a blight on his reputation. I certainly don't subscribe to the latter. It is my favorite Kubrick film after A Clockwork Orange, and it is easier to, even though its subject matter is not particularly easy, it's a film I can always watch. Much the same way that Taxi Driver, Scorsese's masterpiece, if you ask me, is a film that's very disturbing and depressing, but I can always watch. I can always get into it. I can share it with friends if they're interested. And Full Metal Jacket is one of those movies that the instinct always, if someone hasn't seen it, I want them to, and tell me what they think. So Full Metal Jacket, for those of you who don't know, is a Vietnam film that came out in 1987, the year after Platoon. And Oliver Stone's Platoon is more of a conventional Vietnam War film with battle scenes, with strife between a platoon, within a platoon, and different factions of people on the same side fighting with one another. Basically, that's Vietnam. That's our understanding of what a clusterfuck and a disaster Vietnam was. Platoon got a lot of the major awards. It won Best Picture. But I have always believed, now I'm a fan of Platoon. Platoon's terrific. Love Charlie Sheen and Tom Berenger, Willem Dafoe, especially Willem Dafoe, tremendous. And a very young Johnny Depp as the translator, and other terrific actors like John C. McGinley, phenomenal in the movie. A very young Tony Todd, years before Candyman. He's great. I like Platoon a lot. I love Full Metal Jacket. Full Metal Jacket is essentially split into 3 parts. Not officially. It's not a Pulp Fiction kind of, the Bonnie situation, but the movie sets itself up in that kind of a format where you have this sequence set in boot camp, Paris Island, which is about the first 40 to 45 minutes of the film, and I will go down on this hill. The boot camp sequence in Full Metal Jacket is as magnificent, as brilliant, as bold, as ballsy, as daring, as riveting, as shocking as any piece of cinema that I know about, that I have ever been exposed to. And we're talking decades of study, film school being one of those, because obviously that was the most intensive film study, was when I was actually going to school for it. But I have never seen anything that approaches what Stanley Kubrick did in that sequence within this film. And there is a memorable minute and a half. It's 90 seconds. You all can check this out on YouTube. Again, maybe I'm making all this up. But then again, maybe I'm giving you the straight scoop here. There is a moment in the film while they're in basic where the drill instructor played so memorably, and what a crime, another movie crime, an Academy Award movie crime, that R. Lee Ermey, the late great former drill instructor who became an actor, and he was terrific in so many movies after Full Metal Jacket. He was in 7. He played Brad and Morgan's superior. Was he the chief or the captain? But good morning, wake up, Limber Twins. He had that one great moment where he was kind of winking at his former life as a drill instructor, a little Full Metal Jacket. But he was great in Dead Man Walking as one of the parents whom Susan Sarandon's character meets with. Just a guy who nailed it. But in Full Metal Jacket, he gives a little sing-song speech. Happy birthday to you. It's basically happy birthday to Jesus in the world of the film. And that scene does not go the way you expect. He basically says, God loves you because you kill. And you could give your heart to Jesus, but your soul and your ass belongs to the core. Now, R. Lee Ermey, I should also point out, was not originally cast as the drill instructor. He was, I don't know if Kubrick would have used the phrase technical advisor, but he was the technical advisor for that sequence, the boot camp sequence. And the original actor who was supposed to play the drill instructor, a man, and I believe his name is Tim Colcheri, if I'm not mistaken. He had some kind of, it was either an injury or he got sick. And Kubrick was a guy who, when he was on his own time, meaning working at his pace and his process, he didn't have any issue with things taking forever, doing hundreds of takes, something that should have been shot in a day taking a month. That was his process. That's what he wanted to do. And what they used to say about Kubrick, he doesn't always know what he wants, but he knows what he doesn't want. And he didn't want people gumming up the works, even if it wasn't their fault. And maybe it was that Colcheri took ill with the flu, whatever it was. Kubrick liked the fact that R. Lee Ermey could insult you nonstop for 23 minutes. I think it was 23 minutes. It was some ridiculous amount where he didn't need a script. He could just sit there ripping into you like the drill instructor that he was. So Colcheri ended up not getting used in that part, and Ermey came in and did his thing. Tim Colcheri does appear in Full Metal Jacket. He's the guy who delivers a line which doesn't really seem like much until you think about why he delivers it and what he's actually saying. It's a scene where Matthew Modine's character is on a chopper, And there's a guy with him who is a gunner. And it doesn't really seem to be very much, but Colcheri's character is just, he seems to kind of indiscriminately shooting. And he could be killing the people that we're supposed to be protecting. Guy just doesn't care. And Matthew Modine says, it's a normal question to ask. How do you shoot women and children? And he says, it's easy, you just don't lead him as much. And then he starts laughing and then screams, ain't war hell, ain't war hell. And the overall point of Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket is not ain't war hell, but war is hell. Every piece of it is hell. Every component, from the beginning of basic training, when they immediately start stripping you of any kind of personality and identity by forcing you to shave your head. Well, not even, they're shaving your head. Every component of this process is dehumanizing for the soldiers and for the people who work in the military. It's all bad. There's nothing good. Yeah, it teaches some discipline. They're teaching you discipline so that maybe you'll be less likely to panic when you're getting shot at. Or if your entrails are spilling out, you're not going to cry on the field. You'll die like a man. Whatever the case might be. And so the movie has this boot camp sequence, which is extraordinary. And for those who haven't seen it, I say this all the time, but I mean it every time I say it. If you haven't seen the movie, I'm not going to spoil the big points for you. The boot camp sequence ends with a shocking moment, and we move to Vietnam, which is, it must be many, many months later, because Matthew Modine has gone from his head being shaved to a very, very full head of hair. And the film climaxes with a standoff. Is it near Ho Chi Minh City? But it climaxes with a standoff where the platoon that Modine and Arliss Howard's character, Private Cowboy, they end up, they're probably in the wrong place. But again, the chaos of war. The equipment wasn't great back then. It was easy to take a wrong turn at Albuquerque, as they say. And they're in the wrong place, and they're beset upon by a sniper. And despite having training and superior manpower, they're getting decimated by a sniper. They don't know where the sniper is. Why is this? Could it be one of ours that's gone rogue? You don't know anything. And again, the chaos, the incredible chaos of war. Every piece of this movie is showing the futility, the fear, the panic, and without beating you over the head with it, the fact that there's a lot of fat cats that are making money and they're making decisions for our lives and future generations of our families. We didn't have any say in this whatsoever. Nothing. So Matthew Modine, who plays the lead, whose name is actually Davis. Now, the book was called The Short Timers. There's no book that I know of called Full Metal Jacket. An author by the name of Gustav Hausford wrote a book called The Short Timers, which Kubrick latched onto, and the Full Metal Jacket is an adaptation of that book. And the character that Matthew Modine plays, his name is Davis. And in the movie, we only see it once. I believe only one time. He's wearing a training sweater, but it has his name on the back so that he could be distinguished. If someone else is watching, oh, that Davis he knows what he's doing, or this guy sucks. We better talk to the CO or whatever. So he goes by Joker in the film. And the reason why he goes by Joker is right at the very beginning when the gunnery sergeant, that's the R. Lee Ermey character, Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, is kind of introducing himself to the recruits and just browbeating them ruthlessly, mercilessly, physically threatening them, physically engaging them in a way that he's definitely not supposed to. Modine's character, Davis, makes a couple of, I think, fucking hilarious, like this guy's got moxie, he's got balls. But he says some stuff that he's not really thinking, I'm going to get reamed for this, but he does. The drill instructor who comes to respect him calls him Joker. So he is known as Joker by everyone else in the film. Nobody calls him Davis, not one time. And if there wasn't that brief moment where you see his name on the sweatshirt, you wouldn't know. Now, I only knew that his name was Davis because when I did some reading, they said, yeah, the character's name it's Joker Davis. And I said, Davis? When do they call him Davis? They don't. You have to be looking very carefully during a scene or two where you can see that, his last name on his shirt. Matthew Modine had a very difficult experience on this film. And anybody who worked with Kubrick, there are different levels of difficulty as far as how many takes and some kind of like sort of psychological warfare. Because Kubrick, everybody knew that his IQ was not a normal human person IQ. Stanley Kubrick's IQ allegedly was in Einstein-Curie range. Like, this was not a normal smart person. This was a guy who was Bobby Fischer, 180 IQ. Again, Einstein. This was a guy who would have been splitting the atom if he had not become a filmmaker. So there was always a chance, because he was so much smarter than everyone else, that everything he did was for effect. Everything was about him gaming and trolling and doing what he could to get the best possible performances from his cast. He had an incredible poker face. So Matthew Modine, years later, and think about it, film came out in 87, more than 15 years later, and closer to 20 if memory serves, Modine came out with a book called Full Metal Jacket Diary, which I've read and is a nonfiction account, more a memoir of Modine's recollections. Now, he took a ton of pictures on the set, and this was something that I didn't know, because how could I know at the time? But he talked about his experiences and the positives and negatives and everything in between of working with Stanley Kubrick. And he says it just took him all the time between the movie and the acclaim and people saying, Matthew could have got nominated for something because, man, he's amazing in the film. The character is great, whatever. But Modine told some incredible stories which sound like they really happened based on our understanding of Kubrick, who could be this kind of manipulative filmmaker, this master of psychological warfare. Or maybe he was just looking to get the best shots. Sometimes it doesn't really even matter. So Modine says that he talked with Jack Nicholson. I don't know if he and Nicholson, because Modine was so young, it's not like he and Jack were buddies. Jack was already, probably pushing 50 at the time that Full Metal Jacket was made. But the previous Kubrick film, of course, had been The Shining, which everyone knows was a very difficult shoot. And many in the cast began to kind of lose their marbles a little bit. Jack was going a little stir crazy himself, which I believe helped the performance and helped the character. And Shelley Duvall really struggled. Kubrick gave her a hard time because she just wasn't getting what he needed, giving what he needed as the filmmaker, I should say. So Modine in the book talks about how he said, well, I asked Jack, what was it like working with him? And Jack, rather than get angry at such a vague question, he said something to the effect of, well, kid, the first 100 takes, Stanley's trying to figure out what you can do. The next 100 takes, Stanley's trying to figure out what it is that he doesn't like about what you're doing. The next 100 takes, he's starting to get an idea of where you might be able to give him what he needs. And then after that, you just have to take your chances. Basically, he was saying, be prepared to nail one take after another and have Stanley say, we're going to run it again, or words to that effect. And Modine comes across in the book like he thought that Nicholson was overstating the case. Newsflash, Nicholson was not overstating the case in any way, shape, or form. So the kind of, for me, the essential story of Kubrick and the making of this movie which only has this one little Christmassy thing, the idea that today is Christmas, we kill everything we see. It's like, it's so fucked up. But Modine tells this story. His wife was very, very late in first pregnancy. They were going to have their first child. Again, Modine was very young. He was in his 20s at the time. His career was on the rise. And Modine tells the story that she was about to go into labor. Like, it was imminent. Labor was imminent. And, there was no cell phones. They had those big phones circa 1986. But it's not like anybody is text messaging. And yeah, I'm sure they had old school telex or first generation fax machines on set. But he was getting word. He had friends that were calling the set on a regular, landline to keep him updated. And knowing how long it took Stanley to shoot everything, Modine was confident that he was going to be able to get away to the hospital to watch his first child be born and not miss anything. Because he didn't want to mess with Kubrick, and if he was needed, he would have just prayed, we can get through this and I can make it to the hospital. But the setups were, see, Kubrick was a guy who always acted as if, no pun intended, he was going to shoot something quickly. He just didn't. So the day that they're on set and Modine is in full costume, including weaponry. You know, he's in his mind, he says, yeah, they have me in costume. They're not going to need me today. There's no way Stanley's going to get to me today. So they were shooting a scene, not giving anything away, where one of the soldiers in the platoon is getting shot in the leg, and there is like blood squibs and everything like this going off. Now, when Modine found out what the shooting schedule was for this particular day, he breathed a sigh of relief, because knowing Stanley's process, there was no chance, zero, that he was going to be used today, and most likely not the next day, and possibly not even the day after. It's like when he looked at the shooting schedule, he was like, okay, this is the best, this is great. Even though he's in his gear, there's no way they're going to use me, because it's going to take us all day to shoot this, and then we have 2 more scenes. This is terrific. So as they were prepping the setups for this tricky shot, which is a special effects shot, Modine gets word his wife is in labor, and Stanley is monitoring the situation. They're about 10 minutes away from starting shooting this particular scene, which Modine's character of Joker is not involved. He goes to Kubrick and says, Stanley, I just got word my wife is in labor. With your permission, I know I'm not in this scene here, and I'm not in the next scene and the scene after that we're shooting. I looked at the schedule. I would like your permission to go to the hospital just for the birth of my child, and I promise you I will be back as soon as possible. You know that Kubrick says, I can't let you leave. I'm going to need you today. Modine says, what do you mean you're going to need me today? Stanley, are you changing the sequence of... He says, no, I'm not changing the sequence. I'm not changing the sequence. He said, I'm going to need you today, and I don't know when. I might need you in an hour. I can't let you go. Now, Modine, one way or another, was going to go to that hospital. So he continues to try to reason with Kubrick. Stanley, you know that I'm not criticizing your methods here, but I also know that you're not even going to finish shooting the squib. You're not going to finish shooting that scene today. This is going to be the rest of the day. Kubrick starts getting upset. They start quarreling. They're not screaming at each other, but Kubrick keeps saying, Matt, I need you here. I can't let you go. I can't let you go. I'm sorry, I can't let you go. I'm going to need you later today. You're wrong about the timing, whatever he says to him. Modine very quietly says, okay, Stanley, I know you're busy. You're going to start shooting in a minute or two. I don't want to rile you up. I don't want to mess with you. He's saying all the right things. Kubrick gets back to baseline because he was getting ready to shoot a big scene. Modine walks away, gathers his thoughts, and imagines the disaster of not being at the hospital when he could be, because he's not going to be used here, of not being at the hospital because of the obstinacy, the stubbornness of this phenomenal filmmaker who is convinced, I think he was being serious. He really, in his mind, no, it's only going to be a take or two. Of course I'm going to get to you today. You can't leave. So Modine approached Kubrick again. And according to his account, because Modine's the only person who told this story, Kubrick sure as fuck never told this story. Modine told Kubrick, he said, Stanley, you know I'm in full gear here, right? So yeah. He says, Stanley, I'm going to give you my knife. And I want you to stab me. And then I'm going to stab you, or however you want to do it. I stab you, you stab me. And then we both go to the hospital together, because I am going to the hospital now, whether you like it or not. You are not going to use me as an actor for 3 days from now minimum. I know it and you know it. I'm going to the hospital. Try and stop me. Modine says there's a look in Kubrick's eyes, a look of resignation that he didn't want to fight. And he knew that I was right, meaning Modine, obviously. So Stanley kind of looked up at him and sighed and says, okay, Matt, just try and hurry back, okay? And send your wife my love. Thank you. So Modine goes off to the hospital in time to watch the birth of his first child. And not surprisingly, they didn't finish that scene that day. Modine was not used again for another week. It took so long to shoot these very critical in the film moments. These are not throwaway moments. They were huge moments within the movie, but Modine was not in many of these shots. And that's what he meant by "you're not going to need me," because he knew there were shots that were technically very tricky. And someone like Kubrick, a notorious perfectionist, was not going to be rushing through it. He was going to make sure he couldn't get it any better than what it was. The opposite of Clint Eastwood, who has never liked doing a lot of takes. If he thinks that a take is good, let's move on to something else. But that's why Clint Eastwood, every film that he ever produced and directed, came in on time and under budget, because he trusted the process, he trusted his actors, and he didn't feel a need to keep rerunning scenes if, in his opinion, you know what? I think we got it. I think Tim nailed that. I think Sean got that one pretty good. I think Matt did this. I think Morgan hit his marks. I think Sir Richard was beautiful in this scene. So Modine won that round. He knew that could have gone completely different if Kubrick had continued to fight and said, you know what? I'm not stabbing you. You're going to have to stab me, or something horrendous, because that's like Klaus Kinski and the great German filmmaker Werner Herzog, who I've talked about in a previous podcast, where they did that, where one guy was threatening to kill the other if they stopped shooting the movie, or if you walk off set, I'm going to hunt you down and kill you. It didn't get to that point, thankfully, with Full Metal Jacket. And Full Metal Jacket was only up for 1 or 2 Oscars and not in any of the major categories. And to me, it is a shame. And it's a movie that, if anything, has grown in appreciation over the years, whereas I feel like Platoon, which got incredible rave reviews at the time, Platoon doesn't seem as great now as it did then. Both movies are very powerful, but I believe that Full Metal Jacket is the better representation of not the war itself, but what Vietnam means to the United States, which is a disaster and probably the worst foreign policy decisions made. And the United States, we know over how many hundreds of years, there have been a lot of mistakes that everybody can say is, yeah, this probably wasn't the best idea. But Vietnam, I would argue, almost might be the biggest clusterfuck, to use a military term. But the film works. It hits you in the gut. And there are moments of just incredible power. And Modine's performance is so good because he's a guy who, like, the dichotomy of his character, he wears a peace symbol and then he has something that says "Born to Kill." And it's like, you want to retain even a mildest shred of humanity. And in the movie, essentially is saying, is that even possible in war, in the chaos, in the horror of war? I don't know. But the movie is extraordinary and it gets my highest recommendation. And, Matthew Modine's book is great. You could find it in almost any library. You could, audiobook it. It's just amazing following how the film was made and Kubrick's process and some of the on-set strife. But the fact that when it was all said and done, Modine was grateful for the opportunity. And it's certainly the finest film acting that he's done. He's just amazing in the film. And with that, we have reached the end of episode 35 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. If you've joined me for the YouTube version of the podcast and haven't yet already, don't forget to click like and subscribe, or the audio version on iTunes, Spotify, and the other platforms. If you enjoy the content, please click like and subscribe. I'll be back with episode 36 real soon. Merry Christmas Eve, everyone. Peace on earth, goodwill to all.